Good morning. It is good for us to be here. My name is Starsky Wilson. I am honored to serve as President and CEO of Children's Defense Fund and honored to serve at this moment in time. My charge this morning as we begin the day is really to kind of set the context for why we're here in this opening session focused on our hope for years to come, focused on child well-being in America. I want to note first that we are a blessed people. How do I know we are blessed? We're blessed because the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at Howard greeted us, and she's the person who could call people immediately and say, "It's too cold in here. Please turn the air off," which she did as soon as she came in. So you'll be getting even more comfortable as we go on because we were looked out for by the universe, sending Dr. Tashney Ann DuBrois. Thank you so much, Dr. DuBrois, for your kind welcome, for your work and your team's deployment in working with our events team to make sure all the things that could be possible for us were possible, that space was made available to us, that we could demonstrate the kind of hospitality that we want to, even while you all have a few things going on here. This weekend is the installation of the new president of Howard University. They've got a board meeting happening this weekend. So just a few things, a major lecture happening, but made space for us. And it's good for us to be here. It's more than good. It's kind of the universe conspiring. We're here not just because this is the place that the event planners thought would be the best fit. Not because there was an appropriate room, but because the Children's Defense Fund, as we have come to know it in the last 30 years, the Children's Defense Fund that we as a community of staff and volunteers and sponsors and funders have come to enjoy and to be able to appreciate and extend in many ways began here at Howard University. On May 12th, 1990, Marian Wright Edelman, our founder and president emerita, gave the commencement speech at Howard University. On that day, she laid out the groundwork and a call primarily to black middle-class folk, leaders of the civil rights era who had slipped, and let black children fall through the cracks of their slippage. In that commencement address, she marshaled the moral suasion and courage of that civil rights era, and she called the community into itself. That began a succession of 3 years of discernment and planning with leaders from across the country at convenings in the US and across the water to consider the situation of children in America, and specifically black and brown children. But of course, it doesn't happen just with a speech. Shortly after that, in June of 1991, here at Howard University, a group of students gathered under the leadership and tutelage of one who we'll hear from later today, Marty Rogers, who served as a special assistant in the president's office at the time, helped to put together a convening of 40 students at Howard University to begin to plant the seeds of what came to be known as the Black Student Leadership Network as part of the Black Community Crusade for Children. Of course, a gathering of about 40 students, while that can get a whole lot done, and a speech at a commencement address doesn't get the whole thing done, they followed up. And that next June, Dr. DuBrois, there's this other university you know of, Shaw University. Dr. DuBrois, before she came here, was the president of Shaw University, where in June of 1992, those students who began organizing here at Howard and became the Black Student Leadership Network held the first Ella Baker Child Policy Training Institute that birthed CDF Freedom Schools as a project of organizing for those students. And so there's more than coincidence going on here. That project that began in 1990 and discerned its way through for 3 years manifested itself publicly in March of 1993. When the Black Community Crusade for Children, those convened leaders and elders of the African American community and those students who have been organizing in regional meetings all across the East and the South began to say publicly and declare their organizing agenda for Black communities in order to save our children. And so a 3-year discernment process that began at Howard began to communicate 30 years ago this year to the public what it would do in the interest of its children. And we followed that path a bit over the last few years. We come back to Howard to declare our public policy agenda for the future at CDF, having taken a little bit of a different path, but still a 3-year journey of discerning within communities who we are, who we understand ourselves to be called to be as it relates to our children, and what the vision is for the future. Over the last few years, the Children's Defense Fund staff, team, and volunteers have been listening, discerning within communities, what is this thing that we talk about as child well-being? To be clear, there is no agreed upon definition among even the child advocates in this room. Even though the Government Accountability Office in 2017 called upon the Office of Management and Budget to declare a cross-agency priority for all federal officials and government offices in the executive branch to determine and declare, make a determination around child well-being, and to make this a priority for all the departments, that administration at the time, 2017, who was in the White House at that time? They, for whatever reason, didn't think it was a priority that needed to be taken up. But there's been another administration since. And there is still not movement from OMB. There's still not the acceptance of a declared definition in this federal government for what child well-being is. And there's still not federal policy action to make that come into being. And so, as we understand government to operate in the will of and based upon the pressure from the people, part of what we are here today to do is to share with you what we have discerned by listening to students, scholars in freedom schools across the country, in listening sessions that our team engaged in over the course of the summer of 2021, state offices, the executive office, those in California, Ohio, and New York, all going in to ask parents, caregivers, servant leader interns, and scholars, what does it mean for you to be well? How do you understand your well-being? And then being able to solicit support from one of our larger philanthropies and supporters to then engage in a more structured community action research. And Dr. LaShonda Kilgore went forth and asked more of our own constituents, what does it mean for you to be well? And we began to see and appreciate both the research that folks like Dr. Sanders and Dr. Raghavan have put together about our journey toward child well-being, which we'll talk about more today. But we also began to hear themes from young people about what it meant for them to be well. That first round of conversations, we focused heavily on freedom. We asked folks in 2021, what does it mean? What does freedom mean to you? We came back with marvelous images from young people and words, of course. My favorite image was that in one community, what they said freedom looked like to them was a big black block party with the elders telling stories to the young people. And then as Dr. Kilgore went out, she heard another theme of joy. She understood, and those young people told her, their parents told her the same. It was very helpful to know that parents and young people defined well-being similarly. I say that as a parent. That they saw joy and safety and provision as critical to their well-being. Having paid close attention to the research and listened deeply to our communities, we think the moral authority to define the future lies with these children who will live in it the longest. And so what we've come to do today, having taken that listening approach and taken that research approach, we've begun to define what will be 5 themes for our future and our policy agenda. And because we believe in, we affirm that Sankofa principle that we are here to reach back and get it. We're here to look back in order to move forward. We knew that those there were 5 starts that came out of that first discernment process, and there are 5 themes that come forward in the policy agenda that we will explore over the course of the next 2 days. In that policy agenda, we started first with thinking about, having heard from community, that we need to build just and caring communities. Young people cannot be the source That means it's time for me to be done. Ms. Edelman would say young people don't grow up in programs. They grow up in homes and families and in communities. And so affirming the social determinants of health, we recognize the built environment has much to do with whether children will be well. So an expansion of our source of intervention begins with those communities, and you'll hear more about that today. But we didn't want to leave our legacy work on family stability and economic mobility behind. We do understand, though, that the promise has broken down. This promise that we taught our children, that some of us were taught, that if you defer gratification, get an education, and work hard, you can do better than your parents. We know that millennials are the most educated generation of American history, and they will not do better than their parents. And so family stability and permanence matters. But the ability to return the promise means that we will shift from a focus on child poverty to talking specifically about social mobility and economic mobility, to return the promise of what people told us America owed us. And then we focus on children's health and healing, with the vision that, yes, we will indeed make sure that young people have nurture and health. Nutrition is important. But we also have a moonshot vision that the universal free school meals that we experienced for a time in the pandemic was actually good for all time, for all children, and always. And so this is something they should always have access to. We will continue to focus on education for civic life and meaningful work. We'll reclaim the fact that our schools in America, public schools in America, were not produced primarily or first in order to produce cogs for an economic machine. Rather, they were there to prepare an educated citizenry, to receive the franchise and exercise democracy in a way that it could hold the markets accountable so that there is meaningful work for our young people. And then, of course, we focus on early learning and development. We recognize that there is a right for young people to be attached to their parents, and it begins with the kind of nurture we allow mamas, big mamas, and abuelitas to have with their young people at the beginning stages of their lives. And so with an undergirding politic of children's rights, we will advance a public policy agenda that will pursue child well-being vigorously, maybe even radically, in the context of today's politic. And we came here today and tomorrow to dig a little deeper into that with all of you. And I'm glad that we get to dig in with these kinds of leaders. I should share, someone told me I was supposed to do this, so let me make sure I do it. The 5 zones of this policy agenda that I've shared are available on both handouts with deeper dive information and in the CVent app. And so if you want to save the earth, look in the app. There's more information. But each of our plenary sessions is also themed around one of these, so you'll have a chance to dig deeper and to go into breakout groups to wrestle with these concepts. Today, I am blessed, and we are blessed, to have with us several leaders in this conversation about child well-being, our hope for years to come. And I'm going to begin to step away so that we can enter into conversation with each of them. By way of introduction, you have their information in the app. I'll just share names and attachments and connections here. We're excited to have with us Dr. Mavis Sanders. Dr. Sanders is a researcher with Child Trends whose focus is on child well-being, specifically for Black children and families. We are pleased that her research is close to us, as she has been grounded at the University of Maryland, and she works with one of our partners at Child Trends. We're excited to have her perspective in this conversation as we continue to grow our relationship in their research and hear specifically about child well-being within Black communities. We're also really excited and delighted to have with us Jamirious Mooney, an educator who has Freedom School skills and credentials from round the places. Spending time, he says, proudly coming up through Freedom Schools in Charlotte, in the Freedom Schools Partnership, and bringing that attachment and connection here to the D.C. area. He said, it hit me like a sermon this morning, Keely. He said, I found joy when I came to D.C. He meant Joy Masha from our staff. He found that too, and began to connect with the Freedom Schools movement here, serving in this way as he pursues his master's degree in education at American University. And then finally, introduce you to also a good friend of us and a friend of mine, Dr. Ramesh Raghavan. Dr. Raghavan is one who helped to begin my shaping of this thinking around child well-being back in 2014 and 2013. We met each other about a decade ago. And his work at the Silver School of Social Work focuses on child well-being and our journey toward that as a conceptualization. He's going to need that for his presentation. Child well-being as a conceptualization and work with governments in order to embed child well-being into their work. And so the next voice you will hear, and I invite you to welcome, first to ground us in some of this conversation, Dr. Ramesh Raghavan from New York University.
Thank you for that resounding welcome, Dr. Wilson, and thank you for the invitation to be here with you today. It's truly an inspiration to be at this temple of actualization and higher learning. And so we're talking about child well-being, which is so apropos not only to the mission of CDF, but also to the mission of who we are as individuals. So let me begin by first talking about, and first requesting my slides to be uploaded. There we are. So today I'd like to talk to you about enhancing child well-being, talk a little bit about what the concept of child well-being is so that we have a common shared definition and understanding of what it is that we're going to be talking about. Before I begin, I must tell you that some of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about today are in our forthcoming book that's going to be released in the next few weeks. And if you find these ideas compelling and you purchase the book, we will receive some royalties. Modest royalties. I have 3 points that I want to make today. First, what exactly is child well-being? Can we have a shared understanding of it? Second, how can we actually achieve child well-being? What strategies, programs, practices might allow us to enhance child well-being? And 3, how can we finance child well-being? How can we make sure that public policymakers that are really interested in money can put their money in the service of well-being? So first, what is well-being? So it always reminds me whenever I talk about child well-being to start with this Sufi parable of the 4 blind men of Hindustan. These 4 gentlemen were asked to describe an elephant. And so the man who sort of touches the trunk of the elephant says that the elephant is really like a rope. The fellow who touches the leg says the elephant is like a pillar in some descriptions. But the point really is that each of these individuals is touching a part of the elephant and is thinking that he has understood the elephant. And so while it is undoubtedly true that parts of the elephant are like a rope, part of the elephant is like a little mouse, it's also not true that the elephant is like a rope or a snake, or the elephant is like a pillar. And so that's why it says each was partly in the right and all were in the wrong. And it seems to me that our discourse on child well-being is largely such that child well-being has become something in the eye of the beholder. If you are an educator, you might think child well-being is school readiness or academic performance. If you are a health person, you might think child well-being is making sure that the child hits the growth chart. If you're a mental health person, you might think child well-being is making sure that the child does not have any mental disorder. Now, I think each of us in these spaces is absolutely correct, but school readiness, normal development, mental health, all these could be thought of as expressions or manifestations or characteristics of well-being. None of them are really what child well-being actually is. So what is child well-being, you might ask? Well, this is our attempt to understand what well-being is. This is the so-called 2 sources theory. Both have to be true. That a child displays well-being to the extent that this child acquires certain stage-appropriate capacities that equip the child for a successful future given the environment, and that the child engages with the world in child-appropriate ways. And I'm going to take a minute to talk about those 4 highlighted areas. We use the word stage-appropriate capacities. Well-being fundamentally is capacity acquisition. But these capacities are stage appropriate, not age appropriate. So a child with an intellectual disability may never be able to develop age appropriate capacities, but that does not mean that the child with an intellectual disability is automatically deficient in child well-being. We use the word equip the child for a successful future. There are many capacities that do not necessarily equip children for successful futures. We want those capacities that equip the child for a successful future, whatever that successful future might be for that child. Third, given her environment, environment acts as a constraint to child well-being. So obviously the kind of well-being that a child can achieve maybe in a remote region in Sudan, South Sudan, may be very different from the kind of well-being that a child might achieve in a high-income family on the Upper East Side. But that does not mean that that child in South Sudan is automatically deficient in well-being. It just means that child well-being just looks very different for people in different environments. And within those environments, children can and oftentimes do achieve well-being. The second part talks about what the nature of being a child is. Now, we all know that children are children. We recognize them as children, and they react and engage with the world in very unique childlike ways. And we think that preservation of childhood is a critically important aspect of child well-being. Children are not miniature adults, and they have the right to be children. So this is the two sources theory. And so there are many conceptualizations that derive from the two sources theory. The idea, for example, that social competence, emotional maturity, communication, all of these come together as we think about what child well-being actually constitutes. And while child well-being is inherently a characteristic of the child, the determinants of child well-being are inherently eco-social or social ecological. The determinants of child well-being are not only in child health, but also extend to the family, community, and society at large. But it's important to recognize, certainly in our view, that these are determinants of child well-being. These are the sorts of things that enhance child well-being. These are not what child well-being actually is. So, okay, if we're all agreed on what child well-being is, how can we then best enhance child well-being? Well, if you buy this definition of child well-being, then any child well-being promotional strategy should have certain characteristics. First, that it enhances assets over reducing deficits. It isn't enough to reduce the burden of mental disorder in a child. We have to take a child from mentally ill to not mentally ill, but then not stop there. We have to take the child from absence of mental disease to flourishing or child well-being. It is eco-social rather than individual. While child well-being is a characteristic of children, the determinants of well-being are social. And so we can't have child well-being, as a treatment problem for the child. We have to intervene in the child's family, its community, its sociology, the ecology, in order for us to enhance well-being. Third is population rather than person-oriented. No child lives alone. And no man is an island, as Don said, right? So children are in a complex web of other children and other communities. And so we cannot move the needle on child well-being by focusing on individual children and ignoring the broader population in which children live. Fourth, are upstream. The child well-being extends even to preconception. So we need to drastically think about how can we deploy preventative, how can we deploy upstream strategies, not just strategies when the child is seriously ill physically or emotionally. And finally, they're developmental rather than stage-specific. Children are constantly evolving, and our strategies to enhance well-being necessarily have to take into account the nature of this type of evolution. And so in our book, we resurrect a concept since that's been occurring in the 1970s that we call social vaccines. So social vaccines, as we say here, address the social, economic, structural, and developmental disorders of mental health and child well-being. So all of these determinants are critically important to address in our pursuit towards well-being. And these are some of those specific strategies which we've organized into what are the levels of intervention on the rows and the population characteristics as far as the columns are concerned. So there are some strategies that are deployed at the school level with parents, with providers, and at the community level. And universal is really applicable to the whole child population. Indicated or selective is really for children that may be at risk, and indicated is really for children that are showing early symptoms of whatever disorder that they may be displaying. The strategies and programs that we have highlighted are the ones that we discuss in our book, but they're by no means exhaustive. They're just indicative. And there are several other programs that are totally child well-being supportive. And this morning at breakfast, I was hearing about freedom schools, which sounds like a wonderful way to enhance enrichment of children nationwide, which is absolutely something that we ought to consider as well as a child well-being development strategy. So with that, how can we then finance it? Because every time you talk to a policymaker, they typically ask you, so what do you want me to do, basically? What kinds of investments then can best facilitate and stimulate the successful adoption of child well-being strategies? The key thing to, I think, understand is that because these social vaccines are not really treatments, they're more in the order of wellness programs, our current medically based models of paying for our strategies is largely insufficient. Because our medical current payment models are primarily, classic fee-for-service models are really designed to pay for interventions that treat illnesses, not really programs that promote wellness. So we need to reconceptualize what it means to pay for well-being. And there are probably several ways in which we can already do this, and in fact that we are already doing it, that can be repurposed towards a child well-being agenda. First, paying for alternate outcomes. Thanks to the Affordable Care Act and the rise of pay for performance, we have become used to this idea that we need to pay not just for cure, but for alternative outcomes like value. And there's no reason why we can't use pay for performance and value-based purchasing strategies and things like that to pay for well-being at a population level. And that's the second, paying for outcomes at a population level. Not paying for outcomes at an individual level, because we can never treat our way to child well-being. Paying for outcomes at a population level involves different modalities of payment, such as social impact bonds. There are several very interesting experiments that are being conducted nationwide where people are using social impact bonds, also known as social investment bonds, to try and purchase a whole host of services that can be truly child promotive. And we can talk further about those if you like. Third, paying for novel interventions. So, Dr. Wilson talked about meals, for example. One of the world's largest nutritional interventions is the Chief Minister's Nutritious Midday Meal Program, which has been deployed since the 1980s in India, which serves nearly about 100 million children every day and provides them with a hot cooked meal. And the Indian Supreme Court created a national entitlement to a hot cooked meal for children in government schools, which are largely low income schools. And if you look at the evaluations of those programs, you find that they contribute to school readiness, they increase IQ, whatever that measures. It contributes to retention within school programs. Who would have thought that feeding children is an educational intervention? And that is a social intervention, but it actually turns out that it is. So as we expand our thinking about what to pay for, I think we need to move beyond medical interventions to more social and community-focused interventions. Fourth, paying for novel venues of care. So hospital-based services are not services that are going to necessarily contribute to child well-being. These kinds of programs that we're talking about happen in a variety of different contexts. And so, for example, paying for interventions that can be delivered within child care settings is one example of the kinds of novel venues of care into which we need to insert payment mechanisms. And last, expanding skin in the game. Child well-being can never be the responsibility of the health sector or the social work sector. We all have to contribute to child well-being. And one way to enhance skin in the game is through programs like Children's Service Funds, which in St. Louis, to take one example, is funded by a 1/4-cent increase in sales tax that every member of the county pays, which then goes into a pool that goes to support programs for children. This expands skin in the game because every person that buys anything in the county of St. Louis is a stakeholder in child well-being for kids in that county. These are some of the ideas that we have, and I'd love to learn more about other ways in which we can enhance well-being through some of your experiences as well. I very firmly believe that children are the best investment in the world, and collectively, by understanding what it is that we're going for, making sure that we have strategies that we can deploy, and by financing those strategies in an effective and sustainable manner, I think we can get an enormous return on our investment. I'd be happy to take questions and comments at any time. Please feel free to get in touch with me. Email is usually the best way to reach me, and thank you very much for your attention.
Got it. So we'll get a chance to connect with research and also in conversations. I want to first bring Dr. Sanders into this conversation, primarily on this last piece about how we finance it. I framed the last 30 years. The reality is the theory of the case for many of us doing child advocacy work for the last 30 years has been that we should expand the social safety net. Most of that targeted toward the federal level. Look at the distribution of resources. You landed, Dr. Raghavan, on this conversation about how we finance it, what investments make the most sense. And Dr. Sanders, your research begins to look at what may be even some of the limitations of the safety net as we talk about child well-being. So what might be some of the added or necessary elements going forward to ensure all children are well, even beyond this kind of safety net approach as we think about going forward?
Thank you so much for the question. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, audience, for attending this session. When I think about the well-being of children and the existing safety net, a couple of things come to mind. During 2020, 2021, during the COVID pandemic, what we saw was an expansion of the social safety net. And we saw not only an expansion of things like the child tax credit, we saw the implementation of the safety net programs in a way that was more accessible to children and families. And what we saw was a steep decline in the poverty rate. But as soon as we abandoned those processes, the innovations that the pandemic called for, we've seen a sharp increase. So we're back to those pre-pandemic levels of poverty. There are a couple of lessons there. First of all, we know what we can do to reduce poverty in the US. We've seen how we can remove barriers to access to some of the social safety net programs. But yet we are not yet committed to doing that permanently, right? And so we really have to begin to think about that. And when we think about poverty, we have to also think about it in the terms of increasing economic inequality, which presents a greater stressor on children and families and their well-being. Because Poverty increasingly means that you don't have access to the basic necessities as resources and wealth is concentrated more and more in the hands of the few, right? And that is related to things like early care and education, one's access to that. Again, we can look to COVID to see how that decimated a lot of providers. And luckily, the government is looking into that. The Department of Health and Human Services has a workforce program that Child Trends is one of the partners to see how we can strengthen early care and education in the country, because as the opening remarks mentioned, is foundational, right? Mental health, another thing. COVID sort of, shone a light on the mental health issues of young people in the country and how access to well-trained, culturally responsive mental health is not where it needs to be, and the impact that that has on child well-being. So there's another gap. And lastly, I think in terms of housing, right? And just not housing, but the issue of creating homes and addressing the homelessness issue in the United States. For so many families, and disproportionately for Black families, housing is becoming an issue that affects every aspect of one's life, right? So when one is not permanently housed, then that has implications for employment. It has implications for education and schooling and all of these things about community and where's your sort of place of connection. So that too is an issue that even for people who consider themselves middle class, access to housing that gives access to community and well-being is another issue around the social safety net that we need to be very concerned about.
No, thank you for that. Later today, there was a speaker who may be able to speak to that. Secretary Fudge from the Housing Development will join us. Yeah. So that's a good tee up for that conversation that we'll have a little bit later today. One of the commitments that we made a few years ago when we began to talk about where CDF is going in the future, and it was not without controversy, was that we wouldn't ask for anything from a policy standpoint that young people and their parents in our freedom schools didn't tell us to go ask for. That the grounding and authority for anything we declared publicly had to come from those freedom schools, because those are the people that we serve most directly. And CDF is uniquely positioned in that many of our partners don't have that kind of grounding in community with young people, or that frankly what should be, I think, an accountability to them in a way that we want it to be more accountable. So Jamirious, you have come by that way, as we were talking about this morning. And you've been able to see some of the things that we talk about, and you see it in classrooms right now, you're teaching third grade now. How have you seen experiences where the wellness of a child is impacted by the environment, whether that's in Freedom School, and how have you seen an intervention like an alternative like Freedom Schools make a difference in their well-being?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's an amazing question. And I'm super excited to be here just to share a little bit about that knowledge. And so thinking about that child safety net and thinking about child well-being, when we think about children and developing children and all that they can be and all that they will become, children need a village. One of my teachers when I was in 6th grade used to give us a point, and it was always that children can't be what they can't see. And being a Black child in America, every day in school you see success of whiteness, but you don't see that same success in your own community. And so thinking about child well-being and thinking about giving exposure to children, it takes a village. And I've seen more success, especially through Freedom School, when parents, when community members, when pastors, when teachers, when doctors, lawyers, when all of our partnerships come together to support kids, to give them a different example of what it means to be Black in America, what it means to be a person of color in America. This is a faith-based organization, and so Proverbs says that we have to raise a child up in the way that they should go, and when they get old, they won't depart from it. And this week when I was thinking about that question, that quote from that resonated with me so strongly, and I always wondered why people stop right there. I always wonder why we say, you know, get the kids there, and when they get older, they won't depart from it. But what does raising a child up in the way that they should go mean? What does that look like for modern day time? What does that look like for a post-pandemic society where we have kids who don't like to read? We have kids who don't like to go to school. We have kids who don't feel safe at school. They don't feel safe in their communities. They don't feel safe in their families because they don't have an adult to trust. And that's because we have to do a better job of raising up all of us so that we don't turn away from our ancestors in the way that they banded together to make sure that when we did not have anything, we had each other. When we did not have a house, we had someone's couch that we could lay on. When we did not have what society wanted us to have, we had each other. And so when we're thinking about child well-being, we have to really think about, well, what does that look like for the community? How are we supporting each other so that we can support children? That verse then goes on to say that, you know, the rich will rule over the poor. And it's like, well, I want my children to be rich. I want my kids to have money, but I don't want them to rule over the poor. So what does that look like when we're talking about raising kids to be generous? What does that look like when we're talking about raising kids to advocate for themselves and what they need and what is right for them, while also saying, you know, you can be kind in America without being mean. You can be kind without being a doormat. How are we building kids up to be advocates, to be the leaders that we want? Because we want the kids to be the change we want to see, but a lot of us don't want the kids of this generation to be those doctors, to be those lawyers, and we're not doing enough to support when we're not banding together to be that village for kids of all avenues. Of, you know, we have churches that are providing food, and so Freedom Schools allowed me to see that when the community comes together, you know, we're targeting the literacy scores, but we're also raising these kids to understand that there are a community of people around you. We're doing those social justice lessons. We're having those conversations. When conflict arises, we can go back to Give a Boy a Gun, the book that we're reading, and talk about what that looks like to work through your feelings and not to bully. We can talk about the skin that I'm in and why you should love who you are, and why you should have an inner self-light that carries through you and that you take with you wherever you go, so that when you are out on your own, when you are out doing all the things that we know you can do, we know that those lessons, those life moments are still sticking with children. And so Freedom Schools offers a community aspect that surrounds kids for just the summer, that provides consistency that they don't see in schools when teachers are dropping out because of the teacher turnover rate. It provides meals that some kids don't get to have at home consistently for 6 weeks. It gives them consistently for 6 weeks an adult or a person that looks like them, that isn't older, that's a college student, that doesn't know everything, to say, hey kid, we're working through this together. I don't know everything about life, but I know just enough to make sure I can get you to your next grade and I can get you to love reading. And that's what I think, you know, moving forward as we're thinking about child well-being, we have to get back to building that community so kids can be supported in that way.
If y'all didn't catch like the reading list he was giving y'all, then like check the playback. This is on our platform, so make sure you catch that reading list for your young people. Part of what Jamirious was laying out is also part of your research, Dr. Sanders. It's about community protective factors. So if you would say a little bit about in expanding the frame, opening the aperture to focus on just and caring communities, brings into focus ways in which we need to support some of those protective factors. If you would say a word about some of the things you've named and seen in your research that are protective factors to allow for child well-being.
Absolutely, and it's many of the things that the Freedom School brings to young people. What we've seen consistently in the literature, and I'd love to talk about our priority on protective community factors moving forward and protective community resources. Please check out the website because we will be sharing this information more and more, but what has sort of risen to the top is the notion of the importance of mentors, these natural mentors in children's communities, intergenerational You know, even if it's from the older to the younger to the very youngest, that intergenerational conversation and support for young people. And young people, when they talk about these natural mentors, they're talking about aunts and neighbors and friends and people in the community. So absolutely mentorship and mentors are protective for our young people. And when we look at organizations like CM3, Credible Messenger Mentors, what they're trying to do is to build, to support those mentors in the community to serve as role models and individuals for young people to help them navigate what is an increasingly difficult path toward adulthood. A second thing is neighborhood amenities, right? So when we think about those neighborhood amenities, when you look at Howard's campus, you see trees, you see green space, you see gathering spaces. That's what we're talking about with neighborhood communities as well. Our libraries, our recreation centers, our parks, our sidewalks, things that make communities safe and are connected to neighborhood cohesion. Because if we don't have those spaces, right, oftentimes freedom schools are in these community spaces. They're being held in rec centers or churches. And so we need these spaces for people to gather and to gather safely. So neighborhood amenities also rising to the fore. In terms of community, safety, again, we have that when we have cohesive communities and we need the space. And then the last piece that sort of rises to the top is the notion of positive peer support as well. How are we in our village, as we bring people together, how are we bringing young people together, and how are we giving them the guidance on how to engage with one another across screens, right? Because we'll be talking about social media today and what that means for peer support, but also face-to-face connections, building relationships, building community. How does that happen? And is that a skill that we can begin to teach our young, right, as we are trying to figure out what that looks like in the 21st century? So bringing young people together in these positive spaces is protective for them as well. So these are 4 areas that have really been highlighted in the research to date, and we look forward to going to our families and to our young adults and saying, how does this resonate? And are these factors protective for you? And what are we missing in the research to date?
I want to
turn myself off somehow. I want to elevate this issue. I want to come back. We've talked about community level. I want to come back, Ramesh, to what nations can do. Because child well-being in America, we believe it happens neighborhood by neighborhood. And our source of intervention has really been, unfortunately, a Capitol building that we know can be stopped by insurrectionists. We watched that with some of our children. I watched it with a 13-year-old. I watched it within a month of taking this job and wondered, wait a minute, if our theory of action goes through that building, and white supremacist insurrectionists can stop that building from working, or they can be so dysfunctional that they can only choose one of them to be the Speaker of the House and it takes them a month to do it, then we might have a problem getting our work done through that building. So I need a sense of hope that there are nations who have embraced child well-being at a population level. You told me, because you had it on the slide over there, that we actually have to have some of these interventions at a population level. Dr. Sanders notes it as well, kind of this moment that we had in the pandemic where these population level interventions. Can you talk a little bit about what other nations are doing and how you've been working with them to affirm child well-being at that level and begin to integrate it into what it means to be a part of the citizenry?
Certainly, thank you. Can I just say one quick thing before I get into that question, which is that, nations have myths, some of which are good and some of which are bad. And I think, unfortunately, the American myth of individualism doesn't necessarily serve child well-being very well. And I think, nations that engage in a more communitarian, in a more social ethos, I think tend to do better. So now I'll directly answer that question. If you look at countries like Sweden and Iceland and some of the Nordics, for example, you might think, well, they're very wealthy countries. But that's not, the per capita income is not what characterizes them. I think it's their social connectedness, as Mavis has just mentioned, that characterizes their ethos. In Iceland and in Sweden, the moment a woman becomes pregnant, they actually go and register at this infant center, Barnard Central. I'm sure I'm mangling the Swedish here. But where someone comes out, it's like a universal nurse home visiting program. But unlike here, where such programs are sometimes misused for child surveillance purposes, or sometimes, they're very narrowly focused on health, it's not so much on that, it's so much on how are you doing as a mom, how's the baby doing, and how are you faring as a new mom of a new baby in your community. The conversation is qualitatively very, very different than the kind of nurse home visiting programs that we see in the United States. Another example, communities that care. I know that scientists are not supposed to have favorite children, but I just love communities that care as a model. I think it's really a community-based resource identification and problem-solving approach that uses researchers as consultants, not researchers as directors, which I think is the appropriate role for a scholar. And it's when community members say, look, this is community food hunger food insecurity is our major dominant need. What do you think that the research can offer us? A scholar can come and say, there are all of these different strategies to combat food insecurities. Which of these might potentially work in your community? And then the CTC model will essentially gather a whole bunch of community members together and say, can we really move this forward, move the needle on child hunger? Many countries overseas embody our tiny programs at a national level. And it seems to me that that is going to be the key. I don't think that we can move the needle on child well-being by turning our gaze towards Capitol Hill. I think we need to move child well-being by turning our gaze towards communities. I think this is going to happen. I think this is going to happen family by family, neighborhood by neighborhood. And the nice thing is we have community organizing models that allow us to instantiate this, that allow us to bring this to fruition. And with these financing models and with the community-based know-how that we have, I think we can have sustainable child well-being at the neighborhood and grassroots level.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take this opportunity to transition to say thank you to our panelists, Dr. Sanders, to Dr. Raghavan, and to Jamirious Mooney. Let's thank them together.